Maria Santos wiped her hands on her apron as she watched the morning rush slowly fade into the quiet afternoon lull. Her small diner, Mama's Kitchen, sat on the corner of 5th and Main Street in downtown Phoenix, a place where blue-collar workers grabbed quick breakfasts and office employees stopped for hearty lunches. The red vinyl booth showed their age, and the black and white checkered floor had seen better days. But the smell of fresh coffee and home-cooked meals made everyone feel welcome. She had opened the restaurant 15 years ago with nothing but a dream and a small inheritance from her grandmother. Born in Mexico, Maria had immigrated to the United States when she was just 19, carrying hopes of building a better life for the family she planned to have someday. The early years were brutal. She worked 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the back office to save money on rent. Every dollar earned went back into the business or was sent home to help her aging parents. The neighborhood had changed over the years. What once was a thriving commercial district had slowly declined as businesses moved to the suburbs. Empty storefronts lined the street, and the homeless population had grown significantly. Maria often saw the same faces walking past her windows, pushing shopping carts filled with their worldly possessions or sitting on nearby benches during the hottest parts of the day. Despite the challenges, Maria refused to give up on her dream or her community. She believed that food was more than just sustenance. It was comfort, dignity, and sometimes hope. Her regular customers had become like family, and she knew their orders by heart. There was old Mr. Peterson who came in every Tuesday for black coffee and apple pie, reminiscing about his late wife. The construction crew from the site down the street stopped by every morning at exactly 6:30 for breakfast burritos and strong coffee. And Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived in the apartment above the flower shop, came in twice a week for soup and conversation. On this particular Thursday afternoon in September, Maria was preparing for the dinner crowd when she noticed a man sitting on the bench across the street. He appeared to be in his 50s with graying hair that reached his shoulders and a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. His clothes were worn and dirty, and he carried a weathered military surplus backpack. What struck Maria most was how he sat perfectly straight, despite his obvious exhaustion. There was something about his posture that reminded her of the soldiers she had seen in movies. The man had been sitting there for over an hour, and Maria noticed he kept glancing toward her restaurant. She had seen hungry people before, and she recognized the look. It was more than just physical hunger. It was the hollow expression of someone who had lost hope. Her heart ached as she watched him reach into his backpack and pull out what appeared to be an empty water bottle. Maria's employee, Carlos, had noticed her staring out the window. Carlos was a young man who had been working at the diner for 3 years while attending community college. He was studying business and often talked about opening his own restaurant someday. Maria saw herself in his ambition and had become something of a mentor to him. "Everything okay, Maria?" Carlos asked as he finished cleaning the grill. "There's a man outside who looks like he hasn't eaten in days," Maria replied, still watching through the window. Carlos looked out and shrugged. "There's always homeless people around here. The city should do something about it." Maria turned to face him with a stern expression. "Those people have names, Carlos. They have stories. They're human beings who deserve respect and compassion." She had always been this way. Even as a child growing up in a small village outside Guadalajara, her mother used to tell her that she was born with a heart too big for her chest. When other children would tease the slower kids at school, Maria would step in to defend them. When stray dogs wandered into their yard, she would sneak them food from the family's meager supplies. As the afternoon wore on, Maria found herself unable to concentrate on her usual tasks. She kept checking on the man through the window, watching as he seemed to grow weaker. The September heat was brutal, reaching nearly 100 degrees, and she could see that he was struggling. Other pedestrians walked past him without a second glance, but Maria couldn't ignore his suffering. The dinner rush was about to begin, and Maria knew she needed to focus on her customers. But something about this particular man wouldn't let her rest. Maybe it was the way he held himself with dignity despite his circumstances. Or perhaps it was the military backpack that suggested he had once served his country. Whatever it was, Maria felt compelled to act. She had always operated her business on thin margins, and every free meal meant less money for rent, supplies, and employee wages. But Maria had learned long ago that some things were more important than profit. Her grandmother used to say that food shared with a hungry person would always return to you tenfold. and Maria had seen this prove true many times over the years. As she prepared a plate of her famous beef stew with fresh bread and a large glass of iced tea, Maria felt nervous. She didn't know how the man would react to her offer. Some people were proud and might feel offended by charity. Others might be suspicious of kindness from strangers. But she knew she had to try. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Maria stepped outside, carrying the tray of food. The man looked up as she approached, and she was struck by his eyes. They were a clear blue color, but they held a depth of sadness that made her heart ache. Despite his rough appearance, there was intelligence there, and something that suggested he had once been someone very different from the person sitting on this bench. "Excuse me, sir," Maria said softly as she approached. "I noticed you've been sitting here for a while, and I thought you might be hungry. Would you like something to eat?" The man looked up at Maria with surprise and wariness in his eyes. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond, as if kindness had become so foreign to him that he couldn't trust it. His weathered hands gripped the straps of his backpack tighter, and Maria could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. "I don't have any money," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from dehydration and disuse. There was an accent there that Maria couldn't quite place, but his words were measured and precise, suggesting education despite his current circumstances. "I'm not asking for money," Maria replied gently, holding out the tray. "I just thought you looked hungry, and I hate to see good food go to waste." The man studied her face carefully, searching for any sign of pity or judgment. Maria maintained her warm smile, the same one she gave to all her customers. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly nodded and accepted the tray with trembling hands. "Thank you," he whispered, and Maria was struck by the genuine gratitude in his voice. "My name is James. I'm Maria. I own the restaurant across the street. Please take your time eating." As James took his first spoonful of the beef stew, Maria saw his eyes close briefly, as if savoring not just the taste but the simple act of eating warm food. She noticed how carefully he ate, not rushing despite his obvious hunger. Even in his current state, there was a refinement to his manners that spoke of a different past. "This is delicious," James said after a few bites. "Reminds me of my mother's cooking." "Where are you from originally?" Maria asked, settling onto the bench beside him, ignoring the concerned look Carlos was giving her through the restaurant window. "Originally from Virginia," James replied, then paused as if deciding how much to share. "I've been traveling for a while now." Maria sensed there was much more to his story, but she didn't press. She had learned over the years that people shared their stories when they were ready, and pushing usually caused them to retreat further into themselves. As James continued eating, Maria noticed several things about him that didn't fit the typical profile of the homeless individual she had encountered. His posture remained straight and alert, constantly scanning the environment as if assessing potential threats. When a car backfired down the street, he instinctively tensed and turned toward the sound. Most telling of all, despite his unkempt appearance, he maintained a certain dignity and respect in how he spoke and carried himself. "Have you been in Phoenix long?" Maria asked, making conversation while James ate. "About a week," he replied. "I've been walking mostly, taking buses when I can afford them. Phoenix wasn't really my destination, just where I ended up." The afternoon heat was becoming unbearable, and Maria could see that James was still struggling despite the shade from the building. His face was flushed, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite his efforts to stay hydrated with the iced tea she had brought. "Would you like to come inside where it's cooler?" Maria offered. "You can finish eating in the air conditioning." James looked toward the restaurant, then back at Maria. "I don't want to cause problems for your business. People might not want to eat around someone like me." "Someone like you?" Maria's voice carried a hint of indignation. "You mean someone who served our country?" James looked surprised that she had picked up on his military background. "How did you know?" "The way you sit, the way you scan the street, your backpack," Maria explained. "My brother served in the army. I recognized the signs." For the first time, James's expression softened slightly. "Marines," he said simply. "2 tours in Afghanistan. Then you've more than earned the right to eat in my restaurant," Maria declared, standing up. "Come on." James hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly got to his feet. Maria noticed he favored his left leg slightly, and wondered what other invisible wounds he might be carrying. As they walked across the street together, she felt the weight of her decision. She was inviting a homeless stranger into her business during the dinner rush, knowing it might make some customers uncomfortable, but something about James told her this was the right thing to do. Carlos looked nervous as they entered the restaurant, but Maria shot him a look that said she was serious about treating their guest with respect. She led James to a corner booth where he would be most comfortable and least likely to disturb other diners. "Can I get you anything else?" Maria asked as James settled into the booth. "Coffee, dessert?" "This is already too much," James protested. "I can't repay your kindness." "Who said anything about repayment?" Maria smiled. "Sometimes we help people because it's the right thing to do, not because we expect something in return." As James continued his meal, Maria went about her regular duties, but she kept an eye on him. She noticed how he observed everything around him, taking in details about the restaurant's layout, the other customers, and the staff. Despite his circumstances, he carried himself with quiet dignity, nodding politely to other diners and keeping his voice low when he spoke. The dinner crowd began to trickle in, and Maria was pleased to see that most customers barely noticed James in his corner booth. Those who did notice seemed more curious than concerned. One elderly gentleman even nodded respectfully when he saw James's military backpack. As the evening progressed, Maria found herself checking on James more frequently than necessary. There was something about him that intrigued her beyond simple compassion. Despite his obvious hardships, he maintained a strength and presence that suggested he had once been a leader. When he thanked the busboy for refilling his water glass, he looked the young man directly in the eyes and spoke with genuine appreciation. "Maria," Carlos whispered when she passed by the kitchen, "some of the other business owners have been complaining about homeless people hanging around. They might not like seeing him in here." "Then they can eat somewhere else," Maria replied firmly. "This is my restaurant, and I decide who's welcome here." Carlos shook his head but continued his work.
He had learned not to argue with Maria when she made up her mind about something,
especially when it involved helping others. As closing time approached, Maria realized that James had been sitting in the booth for several hours, nursing a single cup of coffee and politely declining offers for more food. She could see he was reluctant to leave, though whether it was because of the comfortable environment or because he had nowhere else to go, she wasn't sure. "James," she said, approaching his table with a takeout container, "I made too much soup today. Would you mind taking some with you? I hate to waste food." James looked at the container, then back at Maria. "You don't have to do this." "I know I don't have to," Maria replied. "I want to." As James prepared to leave, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Maria. The photograph was creased and faded, but Maria could make out the image of a much younger James in military dress uniform, standing next to a beautiful woman in a wedding dress. Both were smiling radiantly, surrounded by what appeared to be family and friends. The contrast between the man in the photo and the person sitting across from her was heartbreaking. "That was taken 12 years ago," James said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name was Sarah. We were married for 8 years. Maria picked up the photograph carefully, studying the faces of the happy couple. The James in the picture looked confident and strong, with clear eyes and a bright smile. His uniform was pristine, and he stood with the bearing of someone who had found his place in the world. "She's beautiful," Maria said softly. "What happened?" James was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the darkening street. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one caused him pain. "I came back from my second deployment different," he began. "The things I saw, the things I had to do, they changed me." Sarah tried to understand, but how could she? "I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, couldn't be the husband she deserved." Maria listened without interrupting, recognizing the pain in his voice. She had heard similar stories from her brother, who had struggled with his own demons after returning from overseas. "I started drinking to numb the nightmares," James continued. "Lost my job at the construction company because I couldn't focus. Sarah stuck by me for a while, but I was drowning, and I was pulling her down with me." The restaurant had emptied except for James and Maria. Carlos had finished cleaning and was waiting by the door, keys in hand, but Maria gestured for him to wait a little longer. "One night, I came home drunk and angry. I never laid a hand on her, but I said things. Terrible things. She was afraid of me, and I could see it in her eyes. That's when I knew I had to leave. She deserved better than what I had become." James took the photograph back from Maria and stared at it for a moment before carefully tucking it back into his backpack. I've been on the road for 3 years now, he said, moving from city to city, doing odd jobs when I can find them, sleeping wherever I can. I keep telling myself I'll get cleaned up, get help, maybe try to contact her, but every day it gets harder to remember who I used to be. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had always been empathetic, but James's story touched something deep inside her. Here was a man who had served his country, fought for freedom and democracy, only to come home and lose everything that mattered to him. Have you tried getting help from the VA? Maria asked gently. James laughed bitterly. The VA has a waiting list for everything. Mental health services, housing assistance, job training. I tried for months, but the bureaucracy is overwhelming when you can barely function day to day. What about local veterans organizations? I've tried a few, James admitted. Some are helpful, but most are overwhelmed too. There are so many of us and not enough resources to go around. Maria stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. She thought about her own struggles when she first arrived in America, how overwhelming the system could be when you were trying to navigate it alone. At least she had hope and a clear goal. James seemed to have lost both. Where are you staying tonight? She asked, turning back to face him. There's a shelter about 10 blocks from here, James replied, if they have space. If not, there's a park where the police don't usually bother people. The idea of this man, who had once served his country with honor, sleeping in a park because there wasn't room in an overcrowded shelter made Maria's heart ache. She made a decision that surprised even her. I have a small apartment above the restaurant, she said. It's not much, just a couch and a bathroom, but you're welcome to stay there tonight. James looked shocked. I couldn't impose like that. You've already done so much. It's not an imposition, Maria insisted. I rarely use it anymore since I moved in with my boyfriend 6 months ago. It's just sitting empty. Carlos, who had been listening from across the room, gave Maria a concerned look. She ignored him and continued speaking to James. The only condition is that you let me help you figure out a more permanent solution, she said. I have some connections in the community. Maybe we can find you some resources that actually work. James was quiet for a long time, and Maria could see him weighing his pride against his desperate need for help. Finally, he nodded slowly. Just for tonight, he said, and I'll find a way to repay you somehow. The only repayment I want is for you to let me help you get back on your feet, Maria replied firmly. As Maria led James up the narrow stairs behind the restaurant to the small apartment, she couldn't help but think about the strange turns life could take. This morning she had been focused on inventory and payroll. Now she was opening her home to a stranger whose story had touched her heart. The apartment was simple but clean, with a comfortable couch that folded out into a bed, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom with a shower. James looked around with obvious gratitude, and Maria could see how much the prospect of a safe, private place to sleep meant to him. There are clean towels in the bathroom, Maria said, showing him around. Help yourself to anything in the refrigerator. I'll check on you in the morning. As she turned to leave, James called her name softly. Maria, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know why you're doing this for me, but thank you. I had forgotten there were still good people in the world. Maria smiled and squeezed his shoulder gently. Get some rest, James. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to get your life back. As she walked back down to the restaurant, Maria felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. She had always believed that everything happened for a reason, and she couldn't shake the feeling that meeting James was more than just coincidence. There was something about him, something beyond his current circumstances, that told her his story was far from over. Carlos was waiting for her downstairs, shaking his head with a mixture of admiration and concern. Maria, you have the biggest heart of anyone I know, he said. But are you sure about this? You don't really know anything about this guy. I know enough, Maria replied, turning off the lights and locking the front door. I know he's a veteran who needs help, and I know he's a good man who's lost his way. As they walked to their cars, Maria looked up at the apartment window and saw a faint light coming from inside. For the first time in probably years, James had a safe place to sleep, and somehow that felt like the beginning of something important. Maria arrived at the restaurant the next morning earlier than usual, carrying a bag of groceries and a sense of nervous anticipation. She had barely slept, wondering if James was still upstairs or if he had disappeared during the night like a ghost from her imagination. As she unlocked the front door, she heard footsteps above and felt a wave of relief. When she climbed the stairs to check on him, she found James sitting on the couch already dressed and clearly having been awake for some time. His appearance was dramatically different from the day before. He had showered and shaved, revealing a strong jawline and intelligent eyes that had been hidden beneath the rough exterior. His clothes were the same worn items from yesterday, but they were clean and neatly arranged. "Good morning," Maria said, noting how the transformation made him look years younger. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," James replied, standing respectfully when she entered. "I can't remember the last time I had a real shower and a safe place to rest." Maria set down the bag of groceries, which contained breakfast items and some basic necessities she thought he might need. "I brought some things for breakfast, and there are some toiletries in there too." James looked at the bag with obvious gratitude but also visible discomfort. "Maria, you're doing too much. I'm not used to accepting charity." "It's not charity," Maria corrected gently. "It's one human being helping another. There's a difference." As they shared breakfast in the small apartment, Maria learned more about James's background. He had been a staff sergeant in the Marines, responsible for leading a squad of younger soldiers through some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. He spoke with obvious pride about his service and the men under his command, but his voice grew heavy when he mentioned the friends he had lost. "I was good at my job," James said, staring into his coffee cup. "My squad looked up to me and I kept them alive through 2 deployments. But when I came home, I couldn't figure out how to be a civilian again. Everything seemed trivial compared to life and death decisions in a war zone." Maria listened intently, beginning to understand the depth of his struggle. It wasn't just about finding a job or a place to live. It was about finding purpose and meaning in a world that felt foreign after the intensity of military service. "What did you do before you enlisted?" she asked. "I was in college studying engineering," James replied. "Had plans to design bridges and buildings, maybe start my own firm someday. Seems like a lifetime ago." As the morning progressed, Maria convinced James to come downstairs and help her prepare for the lunch rush. She could see he was reluctant to be seen by customers in the daylight, but she insisted that honest work would be good for both of them. "I could use the help," she said, which wasn't entirely true but wasn't completely false either, "and you might find it therapeutic to stay busy." James proved to be surprisingly skilled in the kitchen. His movements were efficient and precise, and he approached each task with the same attention to detail that had probably served him well in the military. Carlos, who arrived for his shift expecting to find Maria alone, was shocked to see the transformed homeless man from the day before working alongside his boss. "Is that the same guy?" Carlos whispered to Maria when James stepped outside to take delivery of fresh vegetables. "Same person, different circumstances," Maria replied. "Everyone deserves a chance to show who they really are." As the lunch crowd began to arrive, Maria noticed how James interacted with the other staff and the customers. Despite his recent struggles, he retained the natural leadership qualities that had made him a successful sergeant. He anticipated needs before they were expressed, helped solve small problems efficiently, and treated everyone with respect and courtesy. One of Maria's regular customers, an elderly veteran named Frank who came in every Friday for lunch, struck up a conversation with James. The two men recognized something in each other immediately, and Maria watched as they shared stories about their service. For the first time since she had met him, James smiled genuinely, and she could see glimpses of the confident man he had once been. "You served in Afghanistan?" Frank asked, his eyes lighting up with recognition and respect. "2 tours with the Marines," James confirmed. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." "Good unit," Frank nodded approvingly. "I was Army myself, but I know good soldiers when I see them." "What are you doing now?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Maria could see James struggling with how to answer honestly without revealing his current situation. "Between jobs at the moment," James said simply, "helping Maria out while I figure out my next step." Frank seemed to sense there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. "I run a small veterans organization here in Phoenix," he said, handing the card to James. "We help guys transition back to civilian life. Maybe we can grab coffee sometime and talk about opportunities." James took the card with obvious surprise and gratitude. "I'd like that very much, sir." After Frank left, Maria saw a change in James's demeanor. The brief connection with another veteran had reminded him that he wasn't alone in his struggles, and that there were people who understood what he was going through. That was good for you, Maria observed as they cleaned up after the lunch rush. I haven't talked to another vet in years, James admitted. I forgot how good it feels to be around people who understand. As the afternoon wore on, Maria began making phone calls to various organizations and contacts she had built up over the years in the community. She spoke with social workers, veterans advocates, and local business owners about resources and opportunities that might be available for James. Her first breakthrough came when she called her friend Carmen, who worked at a nonprofit organization focused on veteran services. Carmen explained that they had recently received a grant to provide intensive case management for homeless veterans, including temporary housing, job training, and mental health services. The problem is that most of the guys we're trying to reach don't know about our services or don't trust the system enough to seek help, Carmen explained. If your friend is willing to work with us, we might be able to help him get back on his feet. When Maria shared this information with James, she could see the internal conflict playing out across his face. Part of him was hopeful about the possibility of getting real help, but another part was afraid of being disappointed again by bureaucratic promises that might not materialize. What if it doesn't work out? James asked. What if I go through all the paperwork and interviews and they can't really help me? Then we'll try something else, Maria replied firmly. But you can't give up before you even try. You've been surviving on your own for 3 years. That takes incredible strength. Now let's use that strength to build something better. As evening approached, Maria made another decision that surprised even her. She offered James a temporary job at the restaurant while he worked with the veterans organization to get back on his feet. I can't pay much, she admitted, but it would be enough to cover basic needs. And you could stay in the apartment upstairs until you find something more permanent. James was quiet for a long time, and Maria could see tears forming in his eyes. The offer represented more than just employment. It was a chance at dignity, purpose, and hope. Why are you doing this? He asked finally. You don't owe me anything. Because everyone deserves a second chance, Maria replied. And because I believe there's a reason you ended up outside my restaurant yesterday. That evening, as James helped close the restaurant and prepare for the next day, Maria watched him work with a sense of satisfaction she hadn't felt in years. There was still a long road ahead, and she knew that helping someone rebuild their life was never simple or straightforward. But for the first time in 3 years, James had hope, and that felt like a victory worth celebrating. 3 weeks had passed since James started working at Mama's Kitchen, and the transformation was remarkable. What had begun as an act of compassion was evolving into something much more significant. James had thrown himself into the work with the dedication and precision that had made him an effective military leader. He arrived early, stayed late, and approached every task with a level of professionalism that impressed both Maria and the other staff members. The restaurant's regular customers had quickly grown fond of James. His military bearing and genuine courtesy made him popular, especially among the older patrons who appreciated his respectful manner. Several customers had specifically asked Maria to make sure James was working when they came in, and she had noticed an uptick in business since he started. James had also begun working with Carmen's veterans organization, attending counseling sessions and participating in job training programs. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but Maria could see him gaining confidence with each passing day. The hollow look in his eyes was gradually being replaced by something that resembled hope. On a busy Tuesday morning, everything changed with a single phone call. Maria was in the kitchen preparing the lunch specials when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number she didn't recognize, but something prompted her to answer despite the morning rush. Mama's Kitchen, this is Maria. Hello, I'm looking for a James Mitchell. I was told he might be working at your restaurant. The voice was professional but carried an urgency that made Maria immediately alert. Who's asking? My name is David Richardson. I'm a reporter with the Phoenix Tribune. I've been trying to track down Sergeant Mitchell for several weeks now. Maria's heart began to race. She looked toward the dining room where James was taking orders from a table of construction workers, completely unaware that his carefully guarded anonymity was about to be shattered. What do you want with him? Maria asked cautiously. I'm working on a story about Medal of Honor recipients, specifically focusing on veterans who have fallen through the cracks of the system. Sergeant Mitchell was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in Afghanistan, but he seems to have disappeared from public view. His family hired me to find him. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. She had been helping a homeless veteran for weeks without realizing she was serving meals to one of the nation's most decorated heroes. "I think you might have the wrong person," Maria said weakly, though she already knew it wasn't true. Staff Sergeant James Robert Mitchell, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, awarded the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism during Operation Enduring Freedom. He saved the lives of 12 Marines and 4 Afghan civilians during a Taliban ambush in Helmand Province. There's a picture of him receiving the medal from the president at the White House. Maria's legs felt weak and she had to sit down. The modest, gentle man who had been quietly washing dishes and serving customers was a genuine American hero. The same hands that had carefully cleaned tables and prepared food had once performed acts of courage that saved lives and earned the nation's highest recognition. "Mr. Richardson," Maria said carefully, "if I were to know where Sergeant Mitchell was, what assurance do I have that you would respect his privacy and dignity?" "Ma'am, his family is desperate to know that he's safe. His ex-wife Sarah has been looking for him for 2 years. She remarried, but she still cares about him deeply. She just wants to know he's alive and okay." The mention of Sarah's name confirmed what Maria already knew in her heart. This was really happening. The broken man she had fed on a park bench was a Medal of Honor recipient, whose family had been searching for him across the country. "I need to speak with him first," Maria said. "If he agrees to talk to you, I'll have him call you back." After hanging up, Maria sat in her office for several minutes trying to process what she had learned. Everything about James suddenly made more sense. His leadership qualities, his attention to detail, the way other veterans immediately respected him. But it also raised troubling questions about how someone who had been honored at the White House could end up homeless and forgotten on the streets. When the lunch rush slowed down, Maria asked James to join her in the office. She could see the concern on his face as he sat down across from her desk. "James, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," she began. "Is there anything about your military service that you haven't told me?" James's expression immediately became guarded. "What do you mean?" "A reporter called today. He's been looking for Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, Medal of Honor recipient." The color drained from James's face and he closed his eyes as if in pain. For a long moment, the only sound in the small office was the muffled noise of the restaurant beyond the door. "How did he find me?" James asked quietly. "He said your family hired him to locate you. Sarah has been looking for you." At the mention of his ex-wife's name, James's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down his face and Maria could see years of suppressed emotion pouring out. "I can't face them," he whispered. "Not like this. They remember a hero, and look what I've become." Maria moved around the desk and knelt beside his chair. "James, you're still that hero. The medal doesn't make you heroic. Your actions did. And those same qualities that made you a hero are still inside you." "You don't understand," James said, his voice breaking. "The night I received the Medal of Honor, I was the proudest man in America. Sarah was there, my parents, my squad members who survived. I thought I had it all figured out. But the medal, it became a burden. Everyone expected me to be perfect, to be this symbol of American courage. They didn't want to hear about the nightmares or the guilt about the men I couldn't save." Maria listened as James poured out the story he had been carrying alone for years. The Medal of Honor had made him a public figure, with speaking engagements and media appearances that felt like a betrayal of his fallen comrades. The pressure to be a symbol, rather than a human being, had accelerated his decline into alcoholism and depression. "I left because I couldn't bear to see the disappointment." In Sarah's eyes, when she realized her husband was just a broken man, James continued. "The medal belongs to the Marine I used to be, not the person I became." "But you're becoming that Marine again," Maria said firmly. "I've watched you for 3 weeks. You're a leader, James. You take care of people. You solve problems. You make everyone around you better." James looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean?" "Carlos looks up to you like a big brother. Frank comes in twice a week now just to talk with you. Mrs. Chen tells me you helped her carry groceries to her car yesterday. You think heroes stop being heroes because they struggle? For the first time, James seemed to consider that his current circumstances didn't negate his past service or his inherent character. The reporter wants to write about veterans who have fallen through the cracks. Maria continued. Maybe your story could help other heroes who are struggling. Maybe admitting that even Medal of Honor recipients can need help would make it easier for others to seek assistance. James was quiet for a long time, and Maria could see him weighing the possibilities. Finally, he looked up at her with the clear, determined expression she had glimpsed on his first day. If I do this interview, if I let people know where I am, everything changes, he said. I can't go back to being anonymous. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Maria replied. Maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting again. James agreed to meet with the reporter, but only on his terms. The interview would take place at Mama's kitchen, with Maria present, and he would have final approval over what was published. David Richardson, the reporter, arrived the next afternoon with a photographer and a recording device, clearly expecting to find a tragic story about a fallen hero. What he found instead was something far more complex and ultimately more hopeful. James had spent the morning preparing for the interview, not by rehearsing answers or trying to present himself in a particular light, but by working alongside Maria to serve lunch to their regular customers. When Richardson arrived, he found the Medal of Honor recipient wearing an apron, clearing tables and joking with an elderly customer about the weather. Sergeant Mitchell? Richardson asked uncertainly. Just James now, he replied, extending his hand. And you must be the reporter who's been tracking me down. The interview began awkwardly, with Richardson clearly struggling to reconcile the image of the decorated war hero with the man who had been living on the streets just weeks earlier. But as James began to tell his story, the reporter's approach shifted from sensationalism to genuine human interest. James spoke honestly about his service in Afghanistan, including the day that earned him the Medal of Honor. He had been leading a patrol through a village when they were ambushed by Taliban fighters. Several Marines were wounded and trapped in the open, while civilians were caught in the crossfire. Without regard for his own safety, James had repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to carry wounded soldiers and civilians to safety, then coordinated the defense that allowed the entire unit to survive. I wasn't thinking about medals or heroism, James explained to Richardson. I was thinking about getting my Marines home alive and protecting innocent people. That's what we're trained to do. But James also spoke candidly about what came after. The overwhelming attention, the pressure to be a symbol rather than a person, and the gradual realization that he was struggling with post-traumatic stress in a very public way. The hardest part wasn't the war, James said. It was coming home and trying to figure out how to be normal when nothing felt normal anymore. Everyone wanted to hear about the heroic moment, but no one wanted to hear about the nightmares or the guilt about the friends I couldn't save. Richardson asked about the 3 years James had spent homeless, and Maria watched as her friend struggled to find words for the depth of his despair during that period. I thought I was protecting my family by leaving, James said. Sarah deserved better than a broken husband who couldn't sleep through the night or hold down a job. I thought if I disappeared, she could move on and remember the man I used to be instead of watching me fall apart. Do you regret leaving? Richardson asked. James glanced at Maria before answering. I regret not getting help sooner. I regret letting pride and shame convince me that I had to handle everything alone. But I don't regret protecting Sarah from watching me self-destruct. The conversation turned to James's current situation and his work at the restaurant. Richardson seemed surprised by the obvious affection and respect between James and Maria, and by the seamless way James had integrated into the small business. Maria saved my life, James said simply, not just by giving me food and shelter, but by treating me like a human being worth saving. She saw something in me that I had forgotten existed. Maria, who had been mostly listening, finally spoke up. James saved himself. I just gave him a safe place to remember who he was. The photographer captured images of James working in the kitchen, talking with customers, and standing beside Maria in front of the restaurant. But the most powerful photo was one taken without posing. James helping an elderly customer to his car, his Medal of Honor visible in a frame on the restaurant wall behind them. Richardson asked about James's plans for the future, and Maria was pleased to hear the confidence in his voice as he answered. I'm working with veteran services to get proper treatment for PTSD, James said. I want to continue working here as long as Maria will have me, but I'm also thinking about ways to help other veterans who are struggling. Maybe my story can help people understand that seeking help isn't weakness, it's courage. After the interview, Richardson pulled Maria aside privately. I've been a reporter for 15 years, he said. I've covered dozens of human interest stories, but I've never seen anything quite like this. You didn't just help a homeless person. You helped heal a genuine American hero. He was always a hero, Maria replied. Heroes just sometimes need reminding of who they are. The article was published 3 days later, but not in the local section as Maria had expected. It ran as the lead story in the Sunday edition, with a large photo of James serving coffee to customers beneath the headline, Medal of Honor, recipient found working in local diner after 3 years homeless. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, Mama's Kitchen had received dozens of phone calls from veterans, reporters, and organizations wanting to help or learn more about James's story. Local veterans groups offered support and resources. A construction company called to offer James a full-time job with benefits. Several customers who had been eating at the restaurant for weeks without knowing James's background returned to thank him for his service. Most importantly, Sarah called. Maria answered the phone at the restaurant and immediately recognized the nervous, emotional voice on the other end. Is this Maria, the woman who's been helping James? Yes, this is Maria. This is Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Well, Sarah Patterson now. I saw the article about James. Is he really okay? Maria looked across the restaurant where James was wiping down tables, unaware that his past was literally calling. He's getting better every day, Maria said carefully. Would you like to speak with him? There was a long pause. I don't know if he wants to speak with me. The article said he left to protect me, but I never wanted protection. I wanted my husband back. Maria called James over and handed him the phone. It's Sarah. The transformation on James's face was immediate and profound. Years of pain, regret, and love passed across his expression in seconds. Sarah? He said quietly into the phone. Maria stepped away to give him privacy, but she could hear both voices crying on the phone. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and when James finally hung up, he was both emotionally drained and visibly relieved. She's coming to Phoenix next weekend, he told Maria. She wants to see me, to talk in person. She said she's proud of what I'm doing here, proud that I'm getting help. How do you feel about that? Maria asked. Terrified, James admitted, but also hopeful. For the first time in years, I feel hopeful. 6 months later, Mama's Kitchen had become something Maria never expected when she first offered a homeless man a free meal. The restaurant was now widely known as the place where Medal of Honor recipient James Mitchell worked. But more importantly, it had evolved into an unofficial gathering place for veterans and a symbol of second chances in the community. James and Sarah's reunion had been emotional and healing for both of them. They spent a long weekend talking through years of pain, misunderstanding, and love that had never really died. While they both acknowledged that too much had changed for them to simply resume their marriage, they had found a way to be friends and sources of support for each other. Sarah, now remarried with a young daughter, visited Phoenix every few months and had become one of Maria's closest friends. The publicity from the newspaper article had brought unexpected opportunities. James had been invited to speak at veterans events and had discovered a talent for public speaking that helped other struggling veterans. He used his story not to glorify his Medal of Honor service, but to demonstrate that seeking help for mental health issues was a sign of strength, not weakness. More importantly for Maria, the increased attention had dramatically improved business at the restaurant. The combination of James's story and Maria's genuine hospitality had attracted customers from across the city. She had been able to hire 2 additional employees and had even started a small catering business. But the most significant change was the informal veteran support network that had grown around the restaurant. Every Thursday evening, James hosted a group meeting in the back dining room where veterans could gather to share stories, offer support, and connect with resources. What had started with just James and Frank had grown to include more than 20 regular participants. On this particular Thursday evening, Maria watched from behind the counter as James facilitated the weekly meeting. The group included veterans from multiple generations and branches of service, from a Korean War veteran in his 80s to a young Marine who had recently returned from overseas. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest and healing. The thing about PTSD, James was saying to the group, is that it makes you feel like you're the only person who's ever felt this way. It convinces you that you're weak or broken or beyond help. But sitting in this room, talking to all of you, reminds me that we're not alone in this fight. A young veteran named Marcus, who had been attending meetings for several weeks, raised his hand. James, when you were living on the streets, did you ever think you'd be here helping people like this? James considered the question carefully. Honestly, Marcus, there were days when I didn't think I'd survive another week. I had completely lost hope that my life could ever be anything but pain and isolation. But Maria taught me something important. Sometimes we have to accept help before we can help others. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened. The man speaking with such confidence and wisdom was almost unrecognizable from the broken person who had sat on the bench across the street just months earlier. After the meeting ended and the other veterans had left, James helped Maria clean up the restaurant as he did every evening. It had become their routine, a quiet time when they could talk about the day and plan for tomorrow. I have some news, James said as he stacked chairs on tables. The Veterans Administration offered me a position as a peer counselor. It would mean traveling around the state, working with homeless veterans and helping them connect with services. Maria paused in her sweeping, not sure how to respond. Part of her was incredibly proud that James had come so far, but another part was sad at the thought of losing her friend and most dedicated employee. That sounds like an amazing opportunity, she said finally. It's exactly the kind of work you're meant to do. I haven't accepted yet, James said. This place working with you, it's become home for me. I don't want to abandon the life we've built here. Maria set down her broom and looked at him seriously. James, do you remember what you told me about saving those Marines in Afghanistan? You said you weren't thinking about medals or recognition. You were thinking about getting people home safely. Yes, this job with the VA isn't about leaving us behind. It's about helping other veterans find their way home just like you did. You can't let fear of change stop you from doing what you're called to do. James was quiet for a moment, then smiled. When did you become so wise? I learned from watching you, Maria replied. You taught me that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen when we choose to help others, even when we're still healing ourselves. The next morning, James accepted the position with the VA. His last day at the restaurant was bittersweet, filled with visits from regular customers who had come to see him off and veterans who wanted to thank him for the support he had provided. But James's departure didn't mark the end of his connection to Mama's Kitchen. He arranged his travel schedule so that he could be back in Phoenix every Thursday for the veterans' meetings. The restaurant remained his home base, and Maria remained one of his closest friends and advisors. 2 years after that first meeting on the park bench, Maria received a call that would complete the circle of transformation that had begun with a simple act of kindness. Maria, this is David Richardson from the Tribune. I wanted to let you know that James has been nominated for the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his work with homeless veterans. Maria sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the honor. The Presidential Medal of Freedom was the highest civilian award in the United States, typically given to individuals who had made exceptional contributions to American society. The nomination cites his advocacy work and the veteran support network he's helped build across Arizona, Richardson continued. But the nominating committee specifically mentioned that none of it would have been possible without the foundation of support and dignity he found at your restaurant. When James called later that day to share the news personally, Maria could hear the amazement in his voice. They want to present the award at the White House, he said. And Maria, I want you to be there. You and Carlos and Frank and everyone who helped me remember who I was. James, this is your moment, Maria protested. You've earned this recognition. No, James said firmly. This is our moment. None of this happens without that day you decided to feed a hungry stranger. Your compassion saved my life and made everything else possible. 6 months later, Maria found herself standing in the rose garden of the White House, watching as the president placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around James's neck. But unlike his first trip to the White House for the Medal of Honor, this time James was surrounded by people who knew his complete story, his heroism, his struggles, and his journey back to purpose. In his acceptance speech, James spoke about the power of simple human kindness and the importance of seeing the dignity in every person, regardless of their circumstances. This medal doesn't belong to me alone, he said. looking directly at Maria in the audience. It belongs to everyone who refuses to walk past suffering, everyone who chooses compassion over convenience, and everyone who believes that every person deserves a second chance. As Maria watched her friend receive the nation's highest civilian honor, she thought about the chain of events that had started with a decision to offer a free meal to a hungry stranger. She had thought she was simply feeding someone who needed help, but in reality, she had helped restore a hero and created a ripple effect of healing that had touched hundreds of lives. The homeless veteran she had fed for free had turned out to be much more than she could have imagined. But in the end, what mattered most wasn't his medals or recognition, but the simple truth that every person has value and potential, regardless of their circumstances. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see that potential and offer the support needed to help it flourish. Standing in the rose garden, surrounded by the most powerful people in the country, Maria smiled as she remembered the nervous young woman who had opened a small restaurant with nothing but hope and determination. She had achieved something far greater than business success. She had helped heal a broken hero and discovered that sometimes the most profound acts of service happen when we simply choose to care about one another.